When it comes to studying for medical school and becoming a medical doctor, the task may seem challenging, daunting, and the information you need to study may seem never-ending. However, with the advent of various technologies, including artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, a variety of mobile apps, and also a variety of online resources such as YouTube itself, studying to become a doctor has actually become easier as the time progresses. When it comes to medical school, most medical courses tend to be around 5 to 6 years. In most countries, the medical courses tend to be around 5 years or 4 years, and they tend to be divided into a preclinical year or preclinical years and the clinical years. During your preclinical years, most of the work tends to be more lab-based. You will be having cadaveric dissections, going to the lectures, listening to the professors talking about new stuff that you probably never heard of before. You'll be seeing, for example, anatomy of the brain and of the nervous system, which might seem pretty daunting for a fresh medical student. Now, when it comes to your preclinical years as a medical student, most of the focus will be basically on anatomy, physiology, examination, and preclinical skills. So you will learn how to examine a cardiovascular system, the lungs, the nervous system at a very basic level, at a medical student level. And you'll also have to learn about the biochemistry, the physiology, the metabolism of the human body, like Krebs cycle, and various new information that is relatively new as you are basically a medical student. And all the scientific learning you will gain throughout your preclinical years can eventually be applied to the clinical scenarios. When you have the patient in front of you and you will have a case in front of you, all what you learned basically has to be used in context within treating a particular patient. Most of the resources I tended to use as a medical student included books, websites, and various apps. I also tended to search a lot of the information on YouTube. I watched videos from Osmosis, Geeky Medics, and other various online resources. Now, when it comes to studying anatomy in your preclinical years is one of the biggest subjects you need to basically pass eventually to your second year, third year, fourth year, and fifth year. Anatomy and the anatomical basis is extremely important for you eventually to examine a patient, because you need to know how the body actually is designed, how the body has a variety of sections, and how each of these sections of the body works. One of the main books I used to study during my preclinical years was, of course, Gray's Anatomy. Gray's Anatomy, this massive book over here, which I now have owned for over 7 years, okay, is an extremely massive book, and it represents most of the things you will need to know for your anatomical examinations. The book of Gray's Anatomy is very well presented. You have a lot of diagrams of, for example, parts of the human body. The labeling is quite clear, and also the designs and the representations of the anatomy are quite easy to understand. Therefore, Gray's Anatomy is not only, I think, easy for medical students to understand, however, it also puts the anatomy in the clinical context. During your studying of anatomy, Gray's Anatomy will give you various clinical scenarios where, for example, something wrong in the anatomy causes a particular problem. Whether it's, for example, a hernia, whether it's a stroke because of the disruption of the circle of Willis, or something like that. Therefore, Gray's Anatomy, I think, is a core book which is extremely important when you are studying your anatomy, and it's, I think, one of the main books you need to know and you need to have in your arsenal as a medical student. The next book, which I personally used a lot during medical school, is Guyton and Hall. Guyton and Hall is a book on physiology, and it's a great book when studying your physiology because it presents the physiology in an easy to understand mechanism. Most of physiology tends to be extremely boring, it tends to be extremely complicated, and Guyton represents the physiology in a clear and easy to understand manner. It presents it in a logical fashion, and the way it's presented makes it easier, of course, to remember. The biggest problem when reading books is that most of the time we tend to scan the book, we don't understand the main concept, and if you're not able to summarize the main concept, then you're not able basically to understand what's going on within the particular context that you're reading. Therefore, Guyton and Hall gives you a better context and a better understanding of a particular physiological issue and explains the physiology in a clear, concise manner. Therefore, I really recommend that you use Guyton and Hall during your studies as a medical student. The next book I'd like to talk about is basically Kumar and Clarke. Kumar and Clarke, there are two versions of the book. One is a pocket version and the other one is a thicker, larger book version with more detail. Now, when it comes to studying for your exams, I think what I would recommend is using the pocket version. The pocket version is easier to understand. It gives you the information in a more condensed and more easier to grasp manner. And of course, in the pocket version, you have a lot of also clinical scenarios which are in context with what you are studying. Kumar and Clarke, the great thing about it is the language used in Kumar and Clarke is more acceptable for the medical student type of understanding. During your time as a student, of course, the concepts that you're studying are still new. They might be difficult to try to visualize in your brain, and therefore it's important that you try to understand in a simple and clear to understand type of text. And in my opinion, Kumar and Clarke was actually pretty simple for me to understand, and it helped me pass my examinations, and eventually I still sometimes use it till today as I want to revise, for example, something before I go to the clinic or to the hospital. So Kumar and Clarke is one of the great books I would recommend you medical students to study in order for you to pass the exams. Next up is Pathology and NeuroAnatomy. Pathology and NeuroAnatomy can be the hardest subjects you need to study during your pre-clinical years. I still remember studying basically the cranial nerves, the pathways of the cranial nerves, the nuclei, for example, the areas that the cranial nerve has to pass through, and the various levels of the nuclei in the pons, the medulla, the brainstem, okay, the various areas of the brain. And this can be pretty daunting when studying it for the first time as a medical student. What I found useful is that although I used to use books, for example, Snell's NeuroAnatomy, and I also used lecture notes in neurology, I used to also look up most of the information on YouTube. On YouTube you can find various lectures, various information. There are great resources like, for example, Osmosis, which teaches you the concepts in a more diagrammatic and easy to understand manner. Of course, there are other various resources you can find. You can search, for example, on Google and gain a better pictographic image of what you're trying to understand. The biggest problem with trying to understand neuroanatomy is not looking at an image. When you have the image in your mind of how the anatomy works and how for example, the nerves pass through the brain and to, for example, the target organs, then you can clearly understand how the anatomy is laid out. And apart from the anatomy, it's also important to know how the physiology and the neurophysiology works, because knowing your neurophysiology can help you as a doctor target a particular area or region of the brain where the damage has occurred. And this is extremely important in your clinical examinations. When we move from your preclinical years to the clinical years, okay, the things can be a bit more challenging because you'll have patients, you'll be going around various wards, you'll be going on medical wards, surgical wards, gynae wards, okay? You'll be going to your neurology wards, etc., etc. And you'll have a variety of different presentations. And of course, not every presentation seems the same. Some patients might not have much clinical signs. You might have patients with pneumonia who are afebrile. You might have patients who are lethargic, degeneration of general condition without much symptoms. However, they might have a sepsis or an underlying urinary tract infection. They might have a stroke. They might have a cardiac issue like an MI, a STEMI or an NSTEMI. And this becomes a bit complicated. Now, the best books I found for me to carry around with me to the hospital because of their bulkiness and because they're easy to understand are the Oxford Handbooks of Clinical Medicine and also the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Specialties. These handbooks are pretty small, they're concise, they have most of the information that you need when working within a particular ward. For example, you're working in a respiratory ward, therefore you have all the information needed for the respiratory system. You're working, for example, in a surgical ward, and you have all the information needed to basically work within the surgical cases you will be approaching. You also have a section on examinations of the body, whether it's neurological examination, whether it's abdominal examination, whether it's respiratory or cardiac. And you also have a section on the emergencies, which are extremely important to know, whether it's an asthmatic emergency, a CHF exacerbation, whether, for example, it's an allergic reaction, and you need to know the various protocols needed to act fast as a, of course, medical student, but eventually as a foundation doctor and eventually as a specialist. The Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine is not just a resource for medical students, but it's also a very important resource eventually when you become medical doctors. Because, as I said before, although you know the knowledge as a medical doctor, you still need to go back to the drawing board, you still need to extract information, and you still need to look up various information, because most patients don't have all the clinical signs and symptoms you would expect in a particular situation. Okay? Therefore, the two handbooks I would recommend for you to carry on the wards and also to study for your medicine surgery, okay, for your psychiatry examinations and eventually for your clinical examinations are the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine and of Clinical Specialties. Apart from that, there are other various books, for example, when it comes to psychiatry, or for example, when it comes to gynecology. I personally in gynecology used Impey, Gynaecology by Lawrence Impey, and this book, in my opinion, was pretty easy to understand, and it gave me most of the information I needed to pass the gynecology examinations. Apart from that, I also used Churchill's surgery book, and Churchill's surgery book basically gives you what you need within the context of what you need to study, whether it's a hernia, whether it's an acute abdomen, whether, for example, it's particular surgeries that you will be carrying out on the human body. Churchill's, I think, is quite a concise book, it's quite easy to understand, and it's pretty easy for you medical students to use for your examinations. Apart from that, you need to know well your ECGs and how to interpret your ECGs, and of course, there are various resources online that you can look up various ECGs and learn from them. For example, Life in the Fast Lane has a very good presentation of various types of ECGs that you can encounter, whether it's a heart block, whether it's, for example, a first degree block, whether it's a second degree block, an AF, okay, a STEMI or an NSTEMI, and there are various examples. I personally used a book related basically to ECG interpretation. However, again, the clinical handbooks give you a good overview of what you need to know for your ECGs. Again, at medical student level, you don't need to be a cardiologist, you just need to know the basics of ECG interpretation, because most of the ECGs that they will give you for your finals and for your medical examinations will be quite obvious ECGs, whether it's an atrial fibrillation, whether it's VT or VF, whether, for example, it is a STEMI or an NSTEMI. Therefore, most of the exam questions that you will be seeing as a medical student will be related to most of the general basics that you need as a foundation junior doctor. Apart from books, other resources that I personally used to study as a medical student included various websites. I personally used websites like Teach Me Anatomy and Teach Me Surgery. I also used a lot AMBOSS. I think AMBOSS is a really great website as it gives you most of the information you need. It also gives you a good question bank where you can actually go to various cases and various scenarios and answer those questions. This, of course, will help you when it comes to your multiple choice questions in your exam phase. Although it's more related to the USMLE examination type of formats, it's the concept and the basic questions are going to be the same. You're going to have most of the same information, and most of the information is retained whether you're studying in the United States, whether you're studying in Europe, or whether you're studying in the UK. So most of the context is actually there. Other websites I personally found extremely important when it comes to clinical examinations, of course, is Geeky Medics. Geeky Medics I still use till this day, okay, when I have a locum or when I, for example, work with certain patients, and Geeky Medics is a great resource because it teaches you how to examine every aspect of the body, whether it's neurological examination, whether it's examination of the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system. It teaches you to look at what signs you need to look out for. It teaches you how to approach the patient and also how to communicate your examination to the examiner when he is testing you. When you're more advanced and you're, for example, going into the foundation years and you want to sit for your MRCP or MRCS, there are various resources such as PASS test which can help you achieve your exams, okay, at a more advanced level. PASS test is a great resource. Of course, it's not free. You might have to pay for it. However, PASS test is more for the advanced medical student and foundation doctor. I think apart from these resources, there are various other resources online. Of course, if you go on YouTube, the amount of information you can find on various aspects of clinical medicine is huge, it's vast, okay? There are various videos you can go and see here on YouTube, and please use those videos because you can learn from those videos. And I use YouTube mostly, for example, for trying to understand the cranial nerves. I used various YouTube videos for clinical examinations and also for anatomy and also for physiology. And when studying, it's important always to summarize, make your information simple, and make it as if you're trying to explain it to another medical student. Therefore, the utilization of peer groups of study are important because peer groups help you teach fellow medical students, and through teaching, you are also learning yourself. I hope the video was interesting, guys. Thanks for watching my channel and see you in the next one.